If you're an athlete looking to increase both your strength and power in the same training session, I'm going to be sharing with you the 5 different variations of a method that we use inside of our program to help all of our athletes improve their overall strength and explosive power. I'm Nick Lyden, certified strength and conditioning coach and owner of the Peak Performance program, but let's get into it. So the method that we use consistently throughout our strength and power phase and even into our third phase where it's a little bit more power speed because we want to hold on to a little bit of strength is a method known as contrast training. And contrast training was popularized a long time ago. I think it really started to kick back up when French contrast training, which is another variation of it, a little bit more advanced variation, really started to get popularized in the athletic development and athletic performance field. But the more it becomes popular, the more and more people are fucking it up. And I'm here to share with you exactly how to do it, a couple different variations that I think are beneficial. I'll give you the pros and cons of them all, and also how you should implement them with the right exercise selection, the right intensity, sets, reps, and all of that. So what is contrast training? Contrast training in its simplest form is a superset, right? Like your traditional superset, but there's a little bit of some magic that we're trying to really work on to enhance our explosive power. And it's simply pairing a heavy compound movement with a power or plyometric movement. Okay, you might be asking, what's the difference between power and plyometric? A simple way to think of this is that a plyometric exercise like a pogo hop or a broad jump or repeat broad jump has to have a very fast eccentric component, so lengthening of the muscle under tension and the tendons, to a concentric portion, a shortening or force producing component of it. Okay, there has to be an eccentric, a very fast, rapid eccentric to a concentric movement to take advantage and to elicit something called a stretch shortened cycle. Okay, so that's where your tendons and muscles lengthen very rapidly. Then there are some proprioceptors that will then, like muscle spindles and Golgi tendons, which will fire and cause that to contract, and you essentially get some free energy and free force production from that. Okay, this is like the elastic strength. A power-based exercise doesn't necessarily have to have as rapid of a eccentric to concentric motion. Power exercises are purely focused on force times velocity. Okay, so force meaning like the weight or the load of your body or the barbell, and then velocity would be the distance that implement or barbell travels divided by time. Okay, so force times velocity or strength times speed. So let's get into the science behind contrast training and why it works so well. All contrast training is trying to achieve something called post-activation potentiation. Okay, it's a big fancy word. Essentially what it means is that we're priming the body to produce high levels of force very quickly and then taking it into a subsequent exercise. So with contrast training, and why the load needs to be heavy with contrast training, is because you need to activate something called high threshold motor units. Okay, so basically what that means is that there are all these motor units in your muscles, and it takes a certain amount of stimulus, load, and force production for them to actually become active and contract. Okay, and we're trying to get the maximal amount of those motor units and muscle fibers to actually contract so we can stimulate them and activate them. When we do this, we also prime our central nervous system, and then on, like I said, on the subsequent exercise, we get to capitalize on this enhanced neural activation to have a greater performance in our jumps, in our power-based movements, and explosive-based movements. So the benefits are enhanced power production and power output. Also something called RFD, or rate of force development. So we're increasing our ability to send a signal down to our muscles to contract and have those muscles contract very rapidly to generate force very, very quickly. And there is another benefit from a programming, strength and conditioning side and from a user side, that you can actually minimize the amount of time or with your programming to work both strength and power. It's a very easy way to get 2 birds with 1 stone, to work both strength capabilities and force production and peak power output with some of the contrast training that we're going to get into. So there are really 5 different types of contrast training. And for most of us, traditional contrast training is going to be the biggest one that you should implement first. Traditional contrast training really highlights and maximizes that post-activation potentiation. Okay, so again, it's a similar movement pattern. That is a key to this. you have to have a similar movement pattern targeting the similar muscle groups. And I like to think about it in terms of where and how the force is being produced. Is it more vertical in nature? Is it more horizontal in nature, right? And then we want to pair that with a similar plyometric or power-based movement that is going to replicate those same force production angles and same muscle groups. So we wouldn't want to do something like a heavy RDL into a box jump, okay? Because the heavy RDL is going to target more of the posterior chain and the hamstrings, while used with a box jump, we're going to be primarily targeting a little bit more of the quads in a squat pattern and a more vertical force in nature pattern compared to a horizontal kind of hip movement with it, where the force production is coming back to front. Okay, so we want it all both vertical or both horizontal, or as much as we can. Sometimes it's more in a 45 with it. So with all of these, except for the exception of one, which I'll get into, we really want to be in the power producing rep ranges. And that, simple as I can state it, 3 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 sets. Okay, 3 to 5, 3 to 5, very simple. The percentages are going to change very slightly throughout this, but with traditional contrast training, we want to be around 80 to 85% of our 1 rep max so we can activate those high threshold motor units. And then we're gonna pair it with something like a box jump. So that is a very, very great one to start to implement. The next one is gonna be a little bit different. It's gonna work a little bit more of the transition of strength into power. It can be a great one to use at the tail end of, say, a strength block to start to transition more into a power block. And this is called complex contrast training. Again, 3 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 sets. We're gonna push the weight up of the first movement up a little bit. So now this is gonna be around 85 to 90% 1 rep max. And then with our power-based movement, we're gonna go anywhere from 30 to 80% 1 rep max for the power-based exercise. So again, it's not a plyometric, it's gonna be more of a power-based exercise. So you can pair something like a heavy RDL with any sort of Olympic lift variation, because those are gonna mimic each other, and we are gonna have a true power-based exercise without a super rapid eccentric to concentric like jump. But there is still a eccentric to concentric, but it's at a much slower rate for this. The next one is called accentuating eccentric contrast training, and I gotta tell you, this is probably my least favorite, not for the adaptations that we get, but because of what it requires. The accentuated eccentric contrast training is doing an overload of your normal 1 rep max. So you're gonna be around 100 to 115% of your 1 rep max, and you're gonna completely cut out the concentric or lifting portion of a movement and focus on a controlled, very slow descent of that heavy load. So if you could normally do an RDL for 315 pounds, you're gonna put on anywhere from 325 to 330. So it's not a weight you can normally do, but you can control the eccentric portion because we are stronger in the eccentric portion of our lift compared to our concentric counterpart. This does activate more high threshold motor units, but it does require some assistance. So it's really hard to do by yourself, because if you're gonna do, say, an RDL that's overloaded, you're gonna have to deadlift it back up anyways. So typically you're gonna need a partner or 2 partners to help with this if it's like an RDL or a bench or a squat. So it's just not quite as easy to implement with a lot of athletes and people who train on their own like a lot of our members do. So an example of this is a heavy RDL into a depth to broad jump. The broad jumps I like with the hinge pattern because we mimic a little bit of that with the actual broad jump, as we're really focusing on bringing those hips through as hard and as fast as we can, which is going to mimic the hinge pattern of driving the hips and glutes through with the hinge movement. The next one is on the completely other end of the spectrum, whereas these have been a lot of strength movements into a plyometric. For this next one, we're really working on the tendon ability to utilize a lot of free energy and develop that free energy so you can get more force from those tendons. So it's called an RSI Contrast Training, which stands for Reactive Strength Index. Almost said reflective. So Reactive Strength Index Contrast Training. So again, we're working on those quick ground contact time. So ground contact time simply means how quickly, if this is the floor, how quickly our feet can come in contact with the ground and then get back off. So it's not a very long duration. We're literally talking milliseconds here. So quick ground contact, like we're just over 100 milliseconds, and a longer ground contact time, we're gonna be more in the 250 plus range with it. So we're gonna pair a plyometric, and typically these are gonna focus a little bit more on ankle plyometrics where you're developing the ankle tendons more. We're gonna focus on a very short and quick ground contact time exercise in plyometric, like a pogo jump, into an extensive plyometric. So we have extensive and intensive. So extensive are very quick, rhythmic type movements, typically more ankle dominant, and then intensive are going to be more things like your power producing from your muscles, a little bit from the tendons, but it's going to be a longer ground contact time where you're really focusing on max height, max distance. So when we go from a very short, quick ground contact time, we're essentially priming the tendons and bodies to get in and out of that eccentric to concentric portion. That amerization phase is what it's called when you have a eccentric, and that little time it takes for you to stop and then go back to concentric, that's called your amerization phase. So we're really focusing on minimizing that amerization phase, which is just critical for any change of direction or any sort of explosive movement where you're having to get in and out very, very, very quickly. So we're priming those body and the tendons to be able to have that quick ground contact time. And then we're gonna go into a longer ground contact time plyometric to carry over some of that quickness of getting in and off the floor. But with the exercise we're choosing, it typically is longer ground contact time oriented, so you're gonna get more power out of it. So essentially we're trying to teach our body to have a very short ground contact time, and then something that normally takes us a lot longer to produce that same height and power with, we're trying to just minimize it, right? We're trying to have a greater impulse and change of force with it. The next one I think is really good for our rugby forwards, people in the scrums, D linemen, or anyone who needs to essentially be in a static position and be very explosive out of that static position. Because when this happens, when we're in that static position, we don't get to take advantage of that stretch, shorten cycle of the eccentric to concentric. We're in a pause position. And anytime we're in a pause position, we are gonna be a little bit limited on the maximum amount of force that we can produce, because it's purely gonna be muscular driven, right? How quickly and how strongly can those fibers contract to produce a lot of force? So even track sprinters coming out of the blocks, you're in a static position, so you need to have what's called, and what we're gonna train is that propulsion phase contrast training. So like I mentioned, we're gonna eliminate the eccentric component. So we're not gonna get any sort of support from our tendons, and they're purely gonna rely on that concentric, very fast contraction to produce a lot of force. Then we're gonna pair that with a similar power-based movement. And again, this is gonna be a power-based movement because we're not getting the eccentric to concentric firing or muscle action. So you can do a couple of different things. I really like Anderson variations of movement. So like an Anderson squat into a seated box jump, because we're taking away that eccentric to concentric and only focusing on concentric portion. Or you can do something like an Anderson bench press into a med ball chest pass where you're pausing before you're going. With this, the load is gonna be a little bit lighter. It's gonna be around 70 to 80% 1 rep max of your normal type movement, because you are coming from that static position, so it's gonna be a little bit harder. And as a bonus for my last one, for everyone who is trying to get just like, I just want a PR right now, I just wanna like smash some weight, there's something called reverse contrast training, and I've used it in a couple of my freebies that I've had out there, but I've taken it away. But reverse contrast training simply flips it. Okay, so instead of priming the central nervous system and body to produce high levels of force on that subsequent movement for more power production, we are gonna do that plyometric movement first to stimulate the central nervous system to fire very rapidly, have that quick rate of force development, and then take that into a squat, a bench, a deadlift, so you can maximize and have a greater PR. So essentially you're stimulating the central nervous system, to fire very quickly. And then when you go into your heavy compound movement where you're trying to PR or just really maximize your strength gains, you're gonna be able to get in and out of the hole better. Your muscles are gonna fire faster, which is gonna make the lift even easier for you. So if you wanted to use this one, typically I would do some warm-up sets, and then I would do 2 to 3 box jumps, hurdle hops, something that's gonna mimic the force nature, so vertical, horizontal, whatever it is for the movement that you're doing, and then go into your lift. So these are the 5 contrast training methods that we use throughout our training and throughout our programs to help our athletes become more explosive, powerful, everything that they need, and help transfer it onto the field. So I hope this was valuable for you. If it was, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and comment down below what you want to see next, as I'm going to be putting out new videos every single week for all of you. Thanks.